I wasn't supposed to be home yet. 2 more days on the road, a few more meetings, and I would have walked through the front door just as expected. But an early flight and a gut feeling I couldn't shake had me pulling into my driveway well before noon. I killed the engine and sat there for a moment, staring at the house. Something about it didn't feel right. I grabbed my suitcase, stepped out, and the quiet hit me first. Too quiet. Usually, the faint hum of music played from inside. Today, nothing. The second thing I noticed was the car. Hers. Parked in the driveway when she should have been at work. My pulse quickened. I stepped inside. The air was still, but there was something off. Something I couldn't put my finger on. The smell? A hint of cologne that wasn't mine. The subtle shift in the furniture? The throw blanket on the couch, slightly rumpled as if someone had sat there recently. My eyes darted to the kitchen. A coffee cup sat on the counter, different from our usual set. A few crumbs littered the floor. My stomach twisted. Then movement outside. I turned toward the window and spotted him. A man I didn't recognize, sitting casually on his porch across the street. Legs stretched out, arms resting lazily on the chair. Watching. When our eyes met, he smiled. I told myself I was overthinking. Long trips mess with your head, make you see ghosts where there are none. But the feeling wouldn't leave. Something had shifted, like stepping into a house that looks the same but feels entirely different. She was warm, too warm, like someone making up for something. Every touch a little too deliberate, every laugh a little too forced. And then there was her phone, always in her hand, screen tilted away, notifications off. She never used to care about that. The neighbor appeared again. Too casual, too familiar. He waved like we were old friends, like he belonged in my world. And then, in passing, he made a comment. Innocent to anyone else but too precise for comfort. Must be nice finally being home, he said, voice slow, knowing. My stomach tightened. He shouldn't have known how long I was gone. I met up with my best friend, told him I had a feeling. He smirked, told me I needed sleep, that I was making something out of nothing. Maybe he was right. But maybe he wasn't. That night she kissed me first. No hesitation, no build-up, just sudden, urgent, like she had something to prove. Her hands gripped my face, her lips pressed hard against mine, but something felt wrong. Too eager, too desperate, like she wasn't in the moment at all. I pulled back slightly, just enough to see her eyes. They weren't looking at me. Not really. For a split second there was distance, like she was somewhere else entirely. Then just as quickly she blinked, smiled, and kissed me again. I wanted to believe it, so I let myself. Later, in the bathroom, I reached for my toothbrush and froze. The shower door was fogged up except for one spot. An imprint, a smudged handprint too high to be hers. My stomach tightened. We hadn't used this shower. I ran my fingers over the glass, feeling the dampness still lingering. Hours later, unable to sleep, I stepped outside for air. Across the street, the neighbor's house glowed softly. And in the upstairs window, a shadow moved. Familiar. Too familiar. My breath caught. Then just as fast as it appeared, it was gone. She started leaving the house more often. No explanations, no real excuses. Just grabbing her bag, saying she needed fresh air or errands, vanishing for hours. When she was home, she was distant, staring at her phone, barely listening, laughing at messages she never let me see. I told myself I was imagining things, until I saw her car. I was driving back from the store when I spotted it, parked on the side of the street near a small cafe we never went to. She wasn't inside. My heart pounded as I scanned the area looking for her, but nothing. When I got home, I checked her social media, scrolling through old posts, searching for something, anything. Then I saw it. Messages missing. Conversations cut off mid-thread. As if she'd carefully erased pieces of herself. Later that evening, the neighbor appeared again, standing by his truck. He smiled like always, too easy, too familiar. Then he said something that stopped me cold. Guess it's been tough on her with you gone so much. He mused, shaking his head. I forced a smile. He shouldn't have known that. But he did. I needed proof. Real proof. So I told her I had another work trip, just one night out of town. She barely reacted, just nodded, too quick, too smooth, like she had already expected it. I packed a bag, kissed her goodbye, and drove off, but I didn't leave. I parked a few streets away, waited, watched. Hours passed. No calls. No texts. No check-ins. At sunset, I drove home. She was in the kitchen when I walked in, startled but covering it well. Then something changed. It was different, Hungry, urgent, like she was trying to pull me back, make me forget. For a second I almost let her. Then I saw it. Just below her jaw, barely there but unmistakable. A faint mark like a thumb had pressed against her skin. Not mine. My breath hitched. My stomach twisted. She saw the change in my face but I forced a smile. Played along. Because now I knew. I had already lost. I needed to see it with my own eyes. Guesswork wasn't enough. That night, while she was in the shower, I set up a small camera in the living room, angled perfectly toward the front door. If she thought I was stupid, fine, I'd let her keep thinking that. Later I met up with my best friend. We sat in his truck, the air thick with silence before I finally spoke. I told him everything. The changes, the late nights, the way she suddenly remembered how to love me when I got too close to the truth. He sighed, shaking his head. Man, don't go nuclear yet. Maybe you're seeing patterns that ain't there. His voice was calm but his eyes weren't. He didn't believe his own words. Still, he added, I'll help you. If something's going on, we'll find out. The next morning I stepped outside and saw the neighbor again. Coffee in hand, leaning against his car, that same lazy smile on his face. He nodded like we shared a secret. Like he already knew how this would end. I sat alone, staring at the screen, waiting for something, anything, that would prove I was wrong. The footage played in silence. She was on the couch, phone in hand. Then a notification. She read it, smiled, really smiled like she hadn't in a long time. Seconds later she grabbed her purse and walked out. I followed her, keeping my distance, my pulse pounding in my ears. She drove with purpose, no hesitation, no second thoughts. When she turned onto his street, my stomach twisted. I parked further down, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. She didn't knock. He didn't hesitate. She just walked straight inside like she'd done it 100 times before. I sat there watching, waiting, my breath coming too fast. Then through the dimly lit window I saw it. The way she moved toward him, the way he reached for her without hesitation. It wasn't casual. It wasn't innocent. And just like that I knew. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was real. And it had been real for a long time. I couldn't sit there any longer. My hands were shaking, my pulse hammering against my skull. Every rational thought told me to turn back, to breathe, to think. But I was past that. I threw open the car door, crossed the street in 3 strides, and shoved the front door open without knocking. There she was. Standing in the middle of the room, frozen, but not in shock, not in guilt. Her expression wasn't one of fear or regret. It was something worse. Relief. Like a weight had been lifted, like she was tired of pretending. My stomach turned, but before I could say anything he moved. The neighbor stood beside her, watching me, calm as ever. Then without hesitation he reached for her, pulled her in and kissed her. Right there, in front of me, without shame, without hesitation. My mind went blank. Everything I had feared, everything I had refused to believe, was right in front of me. There was nothing left to question. No excuses, no explanations. I had already lost. And she wasn't even sorry. She didn't beg. She didn't cry. He just packed. I watched as she moved through the house, collecting her things with the quiet efficiency of someone who had already made this decision long before tonight. No words, no explanations, no apologies. Just the sound of zippers closing, drawers shutting, life being erased piece by piece. I sat on the couch, numb, staring at the floor while my mind played back everything. Every sign I ignored, every moment I brushed off, every time I convinced myself I was being paranoid. She walked past me, suitcase in hand, pausing for only a second. You knew, she said softly, then walked out the door. I called my best friend, barely able to get the words out. He came over, sat with me in silence, let me be hollow. You didn't lose, he finally said. But it didn't feel that way. It felt like I'd lost everything. Hours later my phone buzzed. A notification. I opened it and there it was. A picture of them laughing, arms wrapped around each other. They weren't hiding. They never had to. Days blurred together. I moved through them on autopilot, avoiding places where I might see her, ignoring calls I didn't want to answer. The house felt different, emptier, colder, like it had never really belonged to me. I barely slept. Every creak in the floor, every shadow on the wall reminded me of what was gone. Then one afternoon I saw him. The neighbor. My replacement. He stood by his truck in the grocery store parking lot, loading bags into the back. When he spotted me he didn't look surprised. If anything he looked amused. You knew this was coming, he said like it was a fact, not a question. Like it had been inevitable. I didn't respond. What was there to say? He was right. Maybe I had known. Maybe I just hadn't wanted to see it. That night I packed my bags. The house wasn't mine anymore. Maybe it never had been. I took one last look before walking out the door. No pictures. No warmth. Just an empty space filled with ghosts of what used to be. Then I left. And I didn't look back.